Hi, my name is Charlie Gold, and this is my intellectual AV mix, and I'll be doing it on Martin Luther King Jr. and how he shaped the world today. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15th, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia. He was born into a middle-class family, and both his father and grandfather were Baptist preachers. His parents were college educated, and his father and his grandfather had succeeded in being pastors for a Baptist church in Atlanta. Their home was located in Auburn Avenue, also known as Black Wall Street, because it was home to some of the country's largest and most prosperous black businesses and black churches before the Civil Rights Movement. Yes, he had a pretty secure upbringing, being in a loving family and getting an education. However, he did experience prejudice events growing up in the South. At age 6, one of his white friends told him that his parents would no longer allow him to play with MLK because the children were now attending segregated schools. In the South, during the period of around the 1940s, racial segregation was a huge problem. African Americans had restrictions on their education, housing, rights, and much more. In 1944, King entered Morehouse College in Atlanta. He studied medicine and law and went on to enter the ministry in his senior year. He went on to spend 3 years at the Crozer Theological Seminary and earned a bachelor's degree while becoming president of Crozer's student body, which was a huge stepping stone as it was composed of mainly white students. After Crozer, he went on to Boston University and received a doctorate on a man's relationship to God. He then went on to get married to his wife in Georgia during 1953 and had 4 children. King was now a pastor at Dexter Avenue Church in Montgomery, Alabama. This was a time following the incident of Rosa Parks in 1955, who violated the segregation law by refusing to give up her seat for a white woman. Activists formed the Montgomery movement to boycott the transit system and chose King as their leader. This was a huge stepping stone for Martin Luther King Jr. because it allowed him to get his voice heard. His first speech to the president on the Montgomery boycott inspired many people. His fresh voice and inspiring personality were loved, and he continued to lead the boycott until about 1 year later, the city's buses were desegregated. King went on to organize the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which gave him a national platform to speak. He lectured in all parts of the country and discussed race-related issues with religious and civil rights leaders. Martin Luther King Jr. was convinced that nonviolence resistance was the best weapon in the struggle for freedom. In Alabama during 1963, King was jailed along with hundreds of his supporters, even including schoolchildren. He wrote a letter from Birmingham jail, which he talked about his philosophy of nonviolence and emphasized how important the idea of community was, and this inspired many. Near the end of the Birmingham campaign, King joined other civil rights leaders to organize the historic march in Washington on August 28, 1963, where more than 200,000 African Americans and whites gathered peacefully in front of the Lincoln Memorial to demand justice for all citizens under the law. This is where MLK's famous "I Have a Dream" speech was performed, which he emphasized his faith that all men someday would be brothers. Martin Luther King Jr. was fatally shot at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4, 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. will go down forever as one of the most influential American civil rights leaders. We now have a national MLK Day every year that is celebrated around the world on January 17th. His efforts and campaigns to end racial segregation in the United States will always be remembered and honored in the best way possible. A famous lesson that curated from Martin Luther King was, and still is, violence doesn't always have to be the answer. Thank you.